Just was wondering if you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit more about the kidnapping experience, if it's not too difficult.
Sure. So it's a kind of a long story, but I'll tell it sort of briefly. So I was working with 3 colleagues, Anthony Shadid, Steve Farrell, and Tyler Hicks for the New York Times. And Tyler and I, in particular, have been covering the fighting for about 2 weeks. And it was very, very intense combat. And so we were pretty exhausted and ready to pull out. And as I described earlier, the way the fighting worked in Libya, there was one road that went from the east of the country all the way to Tripoli. And basically most of the fighting that we witnessed took place on or around that road. And so as journalists, we were with the rebels. And as the rebels would push westward, we would push forward with them. And there were all sorts of weapons being used, RPGs, tank fire. There were still planes coming in and bombing, and sniper fire. And so on this particular day, it was March 15th, we were in Ajdabia, and the cities had fallen. The rebels were gaining a lot of ground. And then all of a sudden, Gaddafi's troops started gaining momentum. And so we were in Ajdabia, and we heard the fighting coming closer and closer towards the hospital where we were. And we decided to go check it out. So we went towards the fighting, and as you do as a photographer. And when we got there, I was very scared that day for whatever reason. Some days when you cover war, you're courageous, and some days you're scared. And so I was kind of cowering and not very comfortable. And things were landing, artillery was landing all around us and very close to us. And with mortar fire, there's something called walking mortars into a position. So sometimes when mortars land initially, they're sort of all over the place. And then when they begin to take a pattern and they get closer to you, you know that whoever is controlling that is zeroing in on a position. So that started happening, and the mortars started landing closer and closer to us. And we knew that they were targeting where we were. So we decided to pull back. And we pulled back to the hospital, and we were looking for injured civilians. And then finally, we went back towards the front, and then finally we made a decision to leave the city. And as we pulled out of the city, we had waited too long, essentially. And we were pulling east, and Gaddafi's troops, instead of coming behind us, they flanked the desert. So they went all the way around the desert, and they cut the road. And there was one road out. And so as we were driving towards the east, we saw a checkpoint. And when you're in that position, you make a decision, basically. You decide whether you're going to try and drive through the checkpoint and you run the risk of getting open fired on, or you stop and you say, we're journalists. And so, of course, in that moment, as we're approaching the checkpoint, everyone's yelling something different. Stop the car, go, run, jump out, and everyone's screaming. And so the driver was paralyzed, and the driver just stopped the car and jumped out before any of us can do anything. It said, Sahafa, journalists. And so immediately, the rebels that we had been with started opening fire on that checkpoint. And so we were caught in the middle. And it was basically Gaddafi's troops came to the car, and they pulled all of my colleagues out of the car. And I put my head in my lap and sort of hoped that it was a bad dream. And then I realized that everyone else had gotten out of the car, and I can hear the bullets. And it was, I had to get out. And so I decided, instead of going to the left, I was sitting behind the driver on the left, I crawled across the seat and I went out the right. And I saw my colleagues making a run for it. There was a small building off to the right. And that was where we were going to try and get cover from the bullets. And so we ran across the street, and in that moment, each of us had a soldier on us, sort of pulling at us and like keeping us in the line of fire. And so we were able to break free, and we all gathered sort of behind this building. And at that point, 4 of Gaddafi's soldiers put us down on the ground, face down, and they had their guns to our heads, and they were deciding whether to kill us. And I, fortunately, don't speak enough Arabic to know that they were deciding whether or not to kill us. So I just thought, I just assumed that was sort of the end. But I saw Anthony's expression, and Anthony spoke Arabic because he was half Lebanese. And I saw Anthony's face, and he was looking up into the gun barrel, and we all were because we each had a gun barrel on us. And we each were just begging and just saying, please. And then luckily they decided to just stop and take everything off of us, take all of our belongings. They took, of course, our cameras and our pouches and stuff. I had a money belt in my underwear with $8,000 in cash that for 6 days they never found, and my passport. But they took everything else. They took our shoes off. They took my shoes off and tied me up, tied up my ankles and my wrists behind my back, and they carried me off to a car. And then they carried my other colleague, Steve Farrell. So they put 2 of us in one car and 2 in another. And they held us on the front line as the fighting raged all around us. Literally, they parked us in the middle of the road, and there were bombs landing all around us and bullets going by, and they kept us there for 6 hours. And at one point, the artillery got so close that Tyler was able to break free. And he dove out of the car. He broke through his arms. He dove out of the car. He freed Anthony. And we all were able to dive out and hide under the car. And then they finally decided to move us from that position. And for the first 3 days, it was very violent. They kept moving our position. They threatened us continuously with death. They had guns on us. We were blindfolded and tied up the entire first 3 days. And they brought us to a prison cell in Sirte. They drove us from one position for 6 hours in the back of a pickup truck. They lied all 4 of us in the back of a pickup truck and drove us in the middle of the day at about 11 in the morning under the hot sun to Sirte. And Tyler was able to see out from under his blindfold, and Anthony was able to hear. So between the 2 of them, we understood that at every 45 minutes or so, there was a checkpoint of soldiers, of government soldiers, and they would, every time they realized that there were prisoners in the back of the car, they tried to lynch us, and the driver would speed up. So the driver actually saved us because we would have been lynched. And then we got to the prison, and they kept us there overnight, and then the next morning they flew us to Tripoli. And in Tripoli, the flight to Tripoli was very violent. They tied us to the walls of the plane. It was a military aircraft with netting on the sides. And they beat my colleagues really bad. Because I was a woman, I was sort of spared the gun butt to the head, but I was groped very repeatedly and aggressively. And we ended up in Tripoli, and they put us sort of under house arrest. And we were brought to an apartment, and we had no idea where we were, but our blindfolds were removed, and we were not tied up anymore. And the first day they were there, they were trying to convince us that the Libyan government was actually legitimate and they weren't going to hurt us anymore. And so they had us in a room, and they were going to serve us tea. And there was a TV in the room, and Anthony took the remote control, and he put CNN on while they were talking to us, and our pictures appeared on the TV. And it said, the Libyan government cannot ascertain the whereabouts of these 4 journalists. And so I started screaming and crying and saying, don't you have children? How can you do this to our families? And that night we got one phone call, and we were able to call. Of course, I couldn't remember my husband's phone number. My mother never answers her phone, and my father doesn't answer his phone. So I had no one to call. So the New York Times was like, all my colleagues were like, great, you can call the foreign desk. So I called the foreign editor of the New York Times and said, can you tell my husband I love him? So then 3 days, we kept getting told we were going to be released, and then they showed up. They went out, the day we arrived there, they went out and they said they were going to go grocery shopping for us, and did we have any special requests? And we all, of course, said coffee. And so they came back with like 15 bags of groceries, and we thought, oh my God, we're never leaving. We're going to be here like the rest of our lives. And then they bought us clothes and toothbrushes and brushes, and that was it. And then sort of several times they kept bringing us and saying they were going to release us, and then they brought us back and said it didn't work out. And then they made a lot of demands on the State Department. We were able to talk to someone from the State Department one day. She was a young woman, and it seemed like the Saturday shift because she was not very bright. And she said, she said that she was going to help us, and then the Libyan guy who was sitting at the table said, we need someone from the American government to come to Tripoli to pick them up. And she said, that's not possible. And then the guy was like, okay, the deal's off. You're going back to jail. So then it basically went on for several days. And finally, at the end, the Turkish government acted as a proxy for the Americans, and we were released to the Turks, and the Turks drove us out. That was it. That was it. Here I am.